Florida has had 48 governors, but only one of them lived on the Emerald Coast immediately before he became governor. He's also the only third-party candidate to ever win election here in the Sunshine State. He carried revolvers on his hips, he hated Catholics a bunch, really didn't like alcohol, and somehow became the governor of Florida. This is the wild story of Sidney Johnston Catts. Okay, so Sidney Catts isn't from Florida. He was born in Alabama and came here to the Sunshine State immediately before he ran for governor. He was born in Alabama, the son of a Confederate captain, and he was born in the middle of the Civil War in 1863. But it kind of went downhill from there. He was stabbed in the eye by his nurse when he was 3. He studied law, decided to become a Baptist minister, then ran for Congress, didn't win, and decided to move down to DeFuniak Springs. He became the pastor of another church in DeFuniak, but it didn't pay very well, so he decided to switch careers and start selling insurance. And that was before he switched again and decided to become governor of Florida. In 1916, Catts jumped into the governor's race as a Democrat, and nobody gave him a chance. Back then, winning the Democratic primary meant winning the whole thing effectively. And his opponents were political heavyweights. Progressive Ion Ferris from Jacksonville and the comptroller for the state, W.V. Knott, were the favorites for political insiders, especially Knott. Catts was an absolute nobody. Nobody'd ever heard of him. But that's until he started using his secret weapon, a Ford Model T. He took this Model T all across the state, crisscrossing from small town to small town, while other candidates pretty much stayed in areas that had access to the rail line. He shook hands with a bunch of people that lived in hamlets and out-of-the-way places, and that really paid off in the primary. The other thing that really paid off, telling people how much he hated and distrusted Catholics. I didn't really believe it was that extreme until I looked into it, but he claimed that Catholics were actively plotting the overthrow of the Republican government in order to install the Pope, and not just install him in D.C., he believed that they wanted to install the Pope in San Antonio, Florida. Not San Antonio, Texas, San Antonio, Florida. Population in 1920, 262 people. It consisted mostly of a monastery and a very small college that became St. Leo University, but you get the idea. He believed that there was a huge infiltration and it was going to be based in this place with almost nobody in the middle of Central Florida. Basically, San Antonio would become the new Vatican City, and he believed that Catholics had a huge arsenal of weapons hidden in the cathedral in Tampa, Florida. Only problem, there wasn't a cathedral in Tampa, Florida at that time. Didn't matter though, it fired up a bunch of Protestant voters that didn't really trust Catholics at this point. We weren't that far away from discrimination against the Irish and Italians, people from the Southern Europe area that tended to be Catholics, so a lot of wary eyes towards Catholics, which made them a really good boogeyman. He's also super against alcohol. Those two things, anti-Catholicism and anti-alcohol, typically work together with most candidates for any office. If they had one, they had the other. But my personal favorite thing about Sidney Catts is that he went everywhere with 2 revolvers on, one on each hip.
I keep that thing on me.
So that he could shoot assassins if they decided to attack him. So June 1916 comes around, and Catts is in a primary with Knott and a couple of other people, and it's a really, really tight race. As a matter of fact, it came within a couple of hundred votes, and it went to the Supreme Court for them to decide, because they had this new way of voting in Florida where you had your first pick and your second pick, and anyway, the county registrars didn't do it correctly, so it was all convoluted. Nobody could really tell who won until the Supreme Court ruled in August that Knott, Catts' opponent, was the winner by just a couple hundred votes. We'd actually looked up the data. It was 21 votes. 21 votes is what the Supreme Court said the difference was statewide. So kind of a little bit of a 2000 presidential election thing going on there. Didn't matter. Catts wasn't buying it. By the end of June, before the Supreme Court had ruled, he said that he was going to run in the statewide gubernatorial race after the primary, no matter what. And the Prohibition Party picked him up. And that's why he was the only third-party candidate to win a statewide race and become governor here in Florida. Catts decided to keep hammering the message that got him as far as it did in the Democratic primary. He doesn't like Catholics, he doesn't like alcohol, and he's a populist. At this point in the race, he claimed that Catholics in Apalachicola tried to assassinate him. No word on whether that was actually true or not. His other less popular hobby horse to talk about was that he thought women's dresses were too short. That was an interesting one. Didn't see that coming, but I guess it makes sense. It was the early 1900s after all. But the dramatic shift in the political landscape in Florida came after this primary because a bunch of the newspapers that had previously supported Knott thought that Catts was the actual winner of the Democratic primary, and so they felt like duty-bound to defend Republican values, small r Republican values, and say that, hey, Catts won this thing, so we need to switch who we're endorsing. And so you saw a lot of big media types, local politicians, all started to switch sides because they thought that Catts got a raw deal. And whether or not the newspapers decided to side with him, Catts was ready for war. He told people in his campaign speeches that he had 10,000 men ready to go and march on Tallahassee and take the governorship by force if he didn't win the general election. Election day comes around. You got to remember, there's a much smaller electorate than the actual population of Florida. So there's about 1 million people that live in Florida, and only about 80,000 people actually show up to vote. And that's because at this point, women couldn't vote, and black people effectively couldn't vote either. Of the people that did vote, 39,000 voted for Catts, 30,000 voted for Knott, which meant Catts won. So his inauguration comes around, he gives a big speech, and he says that his victory is the victory of the crackers, and that's what he said, not me, against political elites, the corporations, Catholics, blacks, you name it. It was their victory over them. In the wake of his inauguration, he fired most of the 1,800 political appointees in the Florida state government and put his own people in. He did something that was really amazing. He ended Florida's convict leasing system. So basically, after the Civil War, when slavery ended, the South had a huge problem with manpower. They didn't have a way to get people to pick the crops and do all the manual labor. So what they would do is they would arrest a bunch of people for crimes that maybe weren't crimes, just kind of loitering, stuff like that. And they would put them in prison and then lease those prisoners out to private corporations. It was one of the most evil things probably that we don't talk about in your generic U.S. history class, and he ended it in Florida during his reign. He also expanded the state's university extension programs to improve literacy around the state of Florida. Finally, he's the guy that decided that all kids between the ages of 6 and 16 needed to go to school. He's the guy that instituted compulsory education in the state of Florida. He made a lot of progress, but he had a hot-headed temper, and he did not make a lot of friends in Tallahassee. By the end of his term, the state legislature in Tallahassee was ready to draw and quarter this guy. And the law was closing in too. He was in trouble and accused of bribery and counterfeiting. Eventually, he'd beat those charges, but it took a lot out of him both financially and personally. Catts would attempt to unseat a popular U.S. senator and would lose resoundingly. He tried to run again for governor in 1924 and 1928. He didn't make it out of the Democratic primary either time and decided not to run in the general. That was pretty much the end of the political career for Sidney Catts. Catts died at his home in DeFuniak Springs on Lake DeFuniak, Sunbright, in 1936. That house, by the way, is on the National Register of Historic Places. If you wanted to visit, it's pretty nice. A special thanks to Cindy Zimmerman. She's a realtor here in the Emerald Coast area. If you wanted to buy the house that we're going to show you where Sidney Catts lived in DeFuniak Springs, she'd probably be the lady to go talk to. I don't know if it's for sale right now, but eventually it'll be, right? So if you want to look at that or at least make an offer, I mean, people take offers for houses they don't have on the market all the time. Sidney Zimmerman is your lady. So that's the story of Sidney Johnston Catts, the preacher turned insurance salesman who decided to run for governor. His big policies, prejudice, persistence, and a little bit of populism to make his gubernatorial run actually work once. And he has the distinction of being the only third-party candidate to ever become governor of Florida. So what do you think? Was he a dangerous demagogue? Do you think he did enough good stuff to outweigh the bad stuff? Let us know in the comments. They're down there. You can let us know. MidbayNews.com for more.